Hi, this is Yucca with my 8th guide on Java development, and we're continuing to look at a class file as it's typically structured from top to bottom, and we're busy creating a user.java class which will represent a user of a typical application and so forth. In the previous guide I showed you javadoc, which we put on our class files and any public application program interface, in other words any code which is accessible to other developers. And we do this to document the purpose of our class and how to use the methods and variables that are located within that. Now, the javadoc component typically is the third component in your Java class file. It follows your import statements, of which there can be one or many, and it goes between your last import statement and your class declaration, which is this line of code. Now, the typical fourth component of a Java class file is a constructor. To understand constructors, I'll refer you once again that Java is an object-oriented language. Our class files are used by the Java virtual machine to create new objects out of. Now, this user class file, if I look in my IDE, it should be able to be compiled and run as an object if we create a new object out of it. So I'm going to show you how we create new objects and how we construct new objects. Now, and the purpose of constructors is to provide the Java virtual machine with a window in which to create a new object. And the process of creating a new Java object we refer to as instantiation. And instantiation is achieved through a statement which reads as follows. Now I'm going to create or instantiate a new user object, and I'm doing that because we have a user object or a user class file to use. So just keeping this class file for this tutorial, and I'm going to do a variable declaration and assignment here. I'm going to talk about variables in the next tutorial just so you understand better what I'm doing here, but just to explain a little bit about what I'm doing. In Java, Java is strongly typed. In other words, when we create variables, variables represent state and data. We have to define the type of variable that we're going to use. We're going to create a user, and then we have to provide an identifier. An identifier is a pointer to, in this case, the object as it sits in memory, and we're just going to call it user1, which will be the identifier. And the syntax or the code to create new objects out of is achieved by defining or declaring the type of variable that you're going to use, the identifier, and with the equal sign, and the new keyword. I did discuss what keywords are, and we're going to create a user. So, and we have an error here, just fix it up. We need to terminate it with a semicolon. That's because it's a statement in our main method. And see if there's any. Yeah. So now we're also going to do a print line statement as we did in the previous Hello YouTube examples, and we're merely going to print out that we've created a user object. Now, getting back to constructors. Now, the Java language or the compiler provides you with a default constructor, and I mentioned that the Java virtual machine uses constructors to create objects out of. Now, the default constructor is basically provided for you, and there are a couple of conditions on that. Constructors are not just used to create objects out of, they're also used to create and objects with different state. Typically we initialize state. Remember, state is represented by variables in your application, and we use constructors to populate our Java objects and to provide the objects with initial state typically. So what the language caters for is the ability for you to provide your own constructor to customize the creation of your Java objects, and we're going to cover that in the next or the fourth component of a typical Java class file, we provide constructors. Constructors read as follows, and to create a constructor I'm going to use my IDE here, and going to create a constructor, and a typical constructor looks like this. Now the default constructor that I've used here, which is provided for me by the compiler, looks exactly, or would look exactly as I've provided here. And constructors have a body as is presented by the opening and closing braces, much like classes have bodies, and that being the opening and locate the closing brace over there, and methods have body too. So within our class definition, remember the class definition is everything including the class declaration and the body, and within the body we have our variable declarations, we have our constructors, which we're covering in this tutorial, and we have functions and methods. We'll get to variables and methods in the next coming two tutorials, but regardless, we've created, or we've put in a statement here in our main method to create a new user, and just to verify, created a new user with default constructor. So it's important you understand the default constructor, and I'll explain that a little bit more in this guide, and I'm going to run the file here just to verify that everything should be working, and we get the message here that we've created a new user with the default constructor. Now I mentioned that we can have one or numerous type of constructors. Now the leverage to provide numerous constructors, as I mentioned, is to customize your Java objects and to provide them with state when you create them or when you instantiate them, and this concept will come across clearer in upcoming tutorials once we've got into variables and so forth. Now, as an example, we could create a new constructor here, and the syntax is exactly like the other constructor here, which once again, this is essentially the same as the default constructor provided for you. And a constructor, you don't put any keywords in it, you just put the class file name as follows, and should you wish to provide any data to the constructor to be used to customize the creation of your Java object, you can do so through a more specific constructor, and we can specify arguments or parameters which form part of the constructor signature. Now signatures, I haven't discussed signatures. Signatures basically form part of not just constructors but also methods. The main method here, the signature for that is as follows. It tells us that the main method receives a parameter. A parameter is basically a method signature. It tells us that to use this method, which the Java virtual machine uses to launch our application, it has the ability to receive some string data. We'll get to data types and variables in the upcoming tutorial, but whatever I'm highlighting here forms part of the method signature. And constructors also have the ability to have their own signature, and we'll see how this impacts your ability to interact with the application program interface. Once again, the application program interface is basically the ability to connect the code that you connect your code with. And to be able to connect your code with other code, you need to obey some rules that are set about by the application program interface. Once again, I'll just go to the Java language API, and the language API provides you with the documentation which tells you on how to use the application program interface. The application program interface is based largely upon how you set about your code and so forth. Now we're going to create a new user constructor here, and we're going to specify through the signature of the user constructor that when creating this user object we require at least 3 Java objects, and everything in Java is essentially an object, and we do so as follows. And object 3. So we provided here a new constructor, and the criteria to use this constructor, in other words to create a new user using this constructor here, implies that we need to provide 3 Java objects to this constructor when creating a new user object. And just go and see what this error is here. So just fix it. Semicolon is missing. Now brackets. So code is working again. I'll just run it, and we've created a new user with a default constructor. So we have 2 constructors here. We have the default constructor, which we've provided ourselves, and I did mention and specify that you don't need to provide a default constructor. This is done for you by the compiler, but there's one exception here, and it's important. Because we've provided our own constructor here, where we've specified that this constructor, in order to use or to construct or instantiate a user object using this constructor as opposed to this one, we will get an error if we remove our default constructor, and I'm going to refer you to why. So the compiler only provides you with a default constructor if you haven't specified your own customized constructor, in which case you wish to create more specific user objects as we've set about here. So to rectify this, because now my code is broken, if I try and run the application, I'll no longer get any output here. I get compile time errors because the Java code that I had is broken. I can't use the default constructor. I've removed the ability to use the default constructor because I've provided my own customized constructor. And just to recap, you can have one and multiple constructors, and this is based upon how many different types of objects you wish to create with different state and so forth. But to rectify this code now, I'm gonna include the default constructor myself, and this needs to be done if you provide your own constructor and in turn wish to create new user objects without using the constructor that you've provided yourself. So let's create, as an example, a new user, creating user 2. Just give me a sec. As follows: new user and we have the ability to create a new user, provided that we provide at least 3 Java objects to it. Once again, I'll just refer you to the Java language application program interface. We're simply going to pass in some literal string data, and I'll get into data types and variables in the next tutorial. But just to verify with you, if we go to our system class, going to go and look at the string, and a string is a Java language object as is specified by the programming language. And in order to satisfy the needs of the application or the code that I'm developing here, I'm going to provide 1, 2, 3 objects, and I'm going to use string literals to do that. And once again, these objects that are specified as part of the the constructor signature, these are we refer to as method parameters, and parameters, these are constructor parameters. Parameters are used to specify in your application program interface that to be able to use the code that you're providing, that the constructor needs to be provided with data. That is, it needs at least 3 Java.language objects to be able to be used. So let's rectify this line of code here, and we're simply going to provide 3 string literals as follows. And once again, just to rectify, need a default. If I remove this, I'm just going to provide a default constructor again. And semicolon. Right, so now you see that we have successfully coded. I don't have any warnings or errors here in the integrated development environment, and the constructor that we've used here, this user constructor, and in fact I'm going to Java document the customized constructor here as follows, just so that you understand what we're doing. And Java doc, remember, as follows, and Java doc provides us with information that this method needs 3, or it has 3 parameters or required, and or arguments, and it needs 3 parameters to be able to be used. And we'll document the method, the constructor, a little bit more, and we'll say our customized constructor for a user. So now if I go and show you the constructor that I'm using here, press Ctrl Q in my integrated development environment, you'll see that I'm using the constructor, our customized constructor for user. And we still have the ability to create a user object using the default constructor, but that is because we've provided our own constructor as follows, which looks exactly the same as the one which would be provided for you. So I'm going to include another print line statement here, and created second user with none default constructor. And now if I run the code, I should have a statement should have output that says I've created a user with a default constructor and created a second user with a non-default constructor, and you see that the output here verifies that we've created two user objects. Note that we've done so using a default constructor and our customized constructor. The default constructor isn't documented. Just to verify, if I press Ctrl Q, you'll see that there's no documentation for that. Once again, just so you understand, that the default constructor has to be provided for you should you provide your own customized constructor, which we've done over here. And once again, if I remove the default constructor as follows, just Control Exit the code here, you'll see that I get an error and I won't be able to run my application. And the default constructor, I've removed it, but the application itself currently it doesn't work purely based on the fact that I provided my own constructor. And if I remove my customized constructor, including the default constructor here, just remove it, and firstly you'll see I get an error here because there is no constructor for a user class that we receive, or that we send 3 string literals or objects to. And this is also relevant to arguments and parameters. Now when we construct an object and when we specify data like this, we are providing the constructor with arguments to be used in the construction of the Java user object in this case, and the arguments that we send to constructors and methods can be used within the constructors and methods to interact with the data. And typically in constructors we use arguments to provide customization to our objects, so we can use constructors to initialize variables. We'll get to variables in the next tutorial. I'm just going to rectify everything here again, go through everything once more. So we have our customized constructor, and within the constructor we have a body where we can do things like assign values to variables. We'll get to that in the next tutorial. And just go through here. This is the body of a constructor, and so whatever I highlight between these two brackets, that's the body. That's where you initialize typically state for your variables. We'll get into that in the next tutorial. And we've documented that constructor, and if I go here, look at the Java doc with Control Q, our customized constructor for a user, and we still have or make use of a default constructor here, and Control Q, there's no documentation. But just to recap, if I remove the constructor here, I'll get an error. There's no ability to use a default constructor. We've taken away the ability which is provided by default by the compiler, and we've taken away the ability because we've created our own more specific constructor over here. But we can provide our own default constructor, and like this. You can also document it, so I'll put some Java doc on it, and we can just say our own default constructor receives no arguments. And just to recap what arguments and parameters are: constructor API has no parameters. So once again, parameters, there's nothing in between the parentheses here for the constructor for the user, which means that the signature for the constructor, should you wish to use this constructor, you don't have any parameters and the constructor can't receive any data, in which case you typically won't be able to use any data within the body of the constructor, which is what I'm highlighting there. And going to look at the Java doc here, Control Q. You'll see that our customized constructor for a user, which is what we just documented here, our own default constructor, etc. And this other constructor that we created here, which requires 3 parameters as part of the constructor signature here, it's documented as our customized constructor for a user. Once again, refer you to the Java doc. Our own default constructor receives no arguments. Constructor for API has no parameters, and let's put brackets, parentheses. Anyway, this is tutorial 8. Introduced you to constructors, and constructors typically form the fourth component of a Java class file. As we look at it from top to bottom, we have our package statements, we have import statements. In between your class definition and your class declaration, which forms part of your class definition, between your last import statement and your class declaration, we have Java doc. Java doc tells you and other developers about your code and how to use it, like we've done here with our constructors. And following your class declaration, we have our constructors, and we've documented our constructors as follows. That's the constructor with the documentation. Here's the signature of the constructor. I'll go through that once more, and we have the ability to customize things within the body of the constructor. And the syntax or the code for a constructor is very basic. You specify an access modifier. We'll get to access modifiers and that in an upcoming tutorial or two. And you just merely specify the file name or the Java class file you wish to, or the file that you're busy using, and the file name as defined user.java, and the class name, and you simply, with opening and closing parentheses and braces, which define the beginning and end of the body. And that concludes this tutorial on constructors. Remember, there can be one or more constructors. In the next tutorial, I'll introduce you to variables. Variables represent state in object-oriented programming or in Java, and state is essentially the data which you interact with in your application. And we use methods, which we'll get into the tutorial after that, and methods are used to interact or to alternate the state of your objects. And that concludes tutorial 8. Thank you for watching.